people are coming in, and Shannon gets a live stream going for YouTube, which you can always watch our former writers' lunches on YouTube. We have migrated away from Facebook, so it's a little more accessible. So you'll find us at youtube.com/ at writers lunch, or you can just search for writers lunch. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Daphne Strassert, and we'll be talking about whoops, that's offensive, looking for problematic language. But before we dive straight into that, next week, Sean Morrissey Carroll will be joining us, and he will be talking about American regionalism through fiction, which is an examination of the different areas of the United States and how they differ from each other and how that comes through in writing and how we see that developing in fiction, which is a super interesting take, especially if you're interested in the literary genre. But yeah, so join us next week for that. But let's talk about problematic language. First of all, I am Daphne Strasser. I am an author, editor, and publishing professional. I work with romance and horror, but I do specialize in genre fiction in general. I am also a review coordinator and slash reader for the independent publisher Horror Addicts, um, working with horror books. A little bit about me. All right, so whoops, that's offensive. So, how do you accidentally say something that's offensive? The answer is that you didn't know. You didn't realize that what you were saying had an offensive origin or past, or that it might be harmful to say to someone else or someone from a specific community. So, how do we end up in a situation where you don't really know what you're saying? English in particular uses a lot of idioms. It is something that non-native speakers have talked about being one of the most difficult things to navigate when learning how to speak English is that we have a lot of idioms, metaphors, or cultural shorthands that take some learning, specifically things around baseball, horse racing, stuff like that. And when you're developing idioms, it is when the meaning gets divorced from the literal saying itself. And that's what happens when things become offensive so that we in a contemporary sense don't know what we're saying. Words change meaning over time. The original meaning of a word can become dissociated or forgotten, or in some cases, deliberately hidden, deliberately obfuscated. From their source material. We are repeatedly exposed to things. The more often people say them, the more we come to understand them through their implied meaning rather than their literal meaning. And when people say things over and over again, we start to think of them as not being harmful. Alternatively, you may never have been taught the history of the phrase or word to begin with. And that is something that I found out a lot of these when I was doing my research for this, was finding words that I had simply never examined where it might have come from or had never been exposed to where it might have come from. And that I think is specifically for younger writers, the biggest problem is that we were not taught these things. So for an example, a benign example, the word podcast. Podcast is very divorced from its original word meanings. It is a portmanteau of iPod, which no longer exists, and the word broadcast, which is originally the word broadcast meant to broadly cast seeds when you are sowing a field. You would throw the seeds out in a wide arc so that they hit a large area. When radio and television became a thing, that word changed meaning to mean broadcasting onto the airwaves, just putting things out there and people with receivers would pick them up. So you take the word broadcast, you take the word iPod, and you put them together and you get podcast. And now podcasts are their own thing, so that it's so divorced from its origins that people simply understand that word on its own without thinking about where it comes from. So when we talk about offensive terms, there's an evolution. So we start off with the N word. We all know we're not supposed to say it anymore, right? Especially people within the community have reclaimed it, but I, as a white woman, cannot say this, should not say this. It's not appropriate for me to say. That then transformed into over time, transformed into the more socially acceptable word Negro, which became not socially acceptable. And so we switched to colored. And then from there, we had African American, which was the predominant usage when I was growing up in the 90s. And now Black is the generally accepted and preferred term. And so over time, these at their point in time, each of these words was acceptable, it was commonly used, and it wasn't necessarily offensive, but it became offensive the longer that term was used. And this is something that we see with a lot of offensive terms, is that someone will come up with a newer one, a more sanitized one, a better one, but by its association with the thing itself, right? It becomes a dirty word on its own. So because there is racism in the United States, specifically talking about white people talk, when white people talk about black people, words become derogatory simply by that association because of racism. And so we have to continually find newer words. The same thing happens when we talk about ableism. When you have mentally disabled people, prior to the 1900s, they were referred to as defective. That was how doctors would talk about them. And so someone said, wow, that's a harmful word. I should create something better. So they came up with moron, idiot, and I forget the last one. But those were designations of IQ level. So a person who was a moron had a certain IQ level, acute IQ level. A person who was an idiot had a certain different level of IQ. And then over time, as you would refer to people that way, those became bad words. So we came up with another word, retarded, which is no longer acceptable to use. In 1996, there was a law passed in the United States, scrubbed this word from all official documentation because it wasn't helpful. It was harmful at that point. Shannon, you're going to correct me on my year.
No, I'm not. The
Oh,
United States changed it, but it wasn't until about 2012 that I think the last state, which was, if I remember correctly, Texas, removed it from the different services that we had because we used to have what we would call MRRCs and things like that that actually were like part of our legislature. They're forms that we filled out for people who did have disabilities, that was like the initial title of the form. It was something that was like bound, and we also have service groups that are part of the local governments that would have that in their name, and they went from MR to ID, which means intellectually disabled, which is in itself already a
already
deficient.
becoming a yeah, yeah. So we moved from the R word to special needs. That became our euphemism for people who had low IQs. And IQ itself is problematic, but that is a different discussion. So we moved to special needs, but then special needs became a dirty word. So now we have neurodivergent. And I think neurodivergent is more diverse than any of the words prior to this because we're not just talking about low IQ. We're talking about a number of um, different learning types or different mental disabilities. You can have like ADD, autism, and it comes from a wider understanding of how the brain works. But at some point, this will probably also become a dirty word and we will move on from it. So we got an idea of how things change over time, right? But if you're not aware of your origins, you might find yourself using a word that you didn't know was offensive. So culture can change, but the words, sometimes words stick around. We're going to talk a lot about history today. It's going to be fun. All right, so why should you care? Your words have power, and as an author, your words have more power than most. Um, the history of the words that you use influences connotation, regardless of what the strict definition is and regardless of what the common usage is. It does change the feel of the word, the vibe of the word. And if you have readers who do know the history of the word, they will know that what you're using is offensive. Using problematic language can affect how you're writing and how you as an author are perceived. So if you are trying to reach a wide audience, you may not want to use words that are offensive to your potential readers. It can limit your audience. Exactly the next point. Um, but we are writers and we do sometimes get into our characters' heads. And so it's important to know when something is offensive because if you are writing a racist or ableist or sexist character, you can use this to your advantage. You can give them words in their vocabulary that are offensive because they are an offensive person. I am not saying in this presentation that you should scrub all of these words that we're going to talk about from your writing because that is a level of flavor that can be added. In the words of Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. This is going to be a non-judgmental space because I did not know some of these words, and I did not know even the ones I did know, I didn't know them at some point. So, this may be your first interaction with finding out that this is offensive. I am not going to judge you for having used these words up to this point. It is up to you to determine whether or not you'll continue to use them going forward. I was raised in white suburbia. I was raised in a very we don't see color community, which is its own form of racism. And so I had never encountered the N-word until I was in high school. And at that point, I did not know it was a bad word. And so I would use it because I had heard black people use it, and I didn't realize there was a difference. And so I would use that word, and I didn't realize it was offensive. And once I learned that, I had to change because it wasn't okay that I was doing that, but I had to learn it first. So that's what we're doing here. We're learning. We're all in this together. A small caveat, language is complicated. Communities are complicated and history is complicated. So when I give you the history of these words and say some people find them offensive, please note that not everyone in that community is going to find it offensive. Sometimes words are being reclaimed. Sometimes people are like, I know the history, but whatever. It's too divorced from the context that it's okay, you can use it, right? And you're going to get a different answer from every person you ask about whether or not you can use these words. We will talk some in this about how long is it appropriate for something to become effectively dissociated from its source material where it becomes okay. If no one on earth knows that the word's origin or why it was offensive, if no one knows that, can we just use it? Can we give it its new meaning and move on? Different people will answer that differently. For some people, enough time has passed that, yeah, you can use this word now. For some people, no, not enough time will ever pass. Um, we also have disputed histories. So some people may find them offensive because they believe a certain history, but we may have other versions of history. And I have done my best to note where that there is a disputed history in this presentation. If you have any questions about if what you're writing is reasonable, if it is approaching things in a good manner, or if it is unintentionally offensive, please seek out sensitivity readers. That is what they are there for. Let's get into it. Racism is the biggest section we will be covering because it is the most common one. It's a lot of history. So whoops, that's racist. Starting off strong with cakewalk. It is used to mean something that is accomplished with ease, and it comes from dance competitions from the mid 19th century in which Black people would dance and they would do a mockery basically of white people propriety. They would do an exaggerated sort of ballroom dance with extremely fluid movements. There's videos of it that you can watch, not obviously not of like the mid 1800s, but cakewalks themselves as a style of dance lasted well into the 20th century. Um, Anyway, so the person or couple that did the best at the cakewalk would win a cake as a prize. In the middle of the 19th century, that was awarded by a slave owner. Later on, it was independent. So this is also where we get the phrase take the cake. So why is this complicated? You can simply not use cakewalk because this is a problematic history. However, because the dances were very much making fun of white people, it is seen actually as Black people taking back a bit of power in the direness of their situation. These continued to go on into the 1900s with Black people performing these dances in minstrel shows. And so, depending on who you ask, cakewalk's okay. Judge for yourself. Oh, as we are going on, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Um, yeah. Ooh, what is this comment? This one's weird for me because I remember growing up doing cakewalks, which was kind of a duck duck goose in some ways. Since the music stopped, there would be one less safe space and you'd be out if you didn't get to it. And if you were the last one, you got a prize cake. That's an interesting thing. Shannon you're from the South, right?
Yeah, this was in Katy. This was something we would do annually or more than annually at our neighborhood. It's actually in the tennis court for like the neighborhood events or like the block parties and stuff. So I don't know how widespread it was, but like I'm guessing that at some point somebody who was not part of the original cakewalk, um, you know, uh, culture was like, oh, we want to do this, and then sort of like grabbed and was like, we'll make this fun for kids. So I don't know how
Fascinating.
uh widely it was used in
Fascinating.
that way, but I know when I was growing up, that's what I thought a cakewalk was because that's what we did, and you were really excited to get the cake.
There you go. I mean,
So
so cakewalk as a dance, right? As the style of dance is how we get the meaning of it's accomplished with ease. Because if you go and watch the videos of cakewalk, it is they look like they're floating. It is extremely graceful. It's also exaggerated and silly, but it is extremely graceful form of dance. Um, totally worth going and watching those. Next up, we have the Peanut Gallery. A peanut gallery, as it is commonly used, is a group of critics whose opinions are unwanted. It comes from during the days of segregation. The cheapest and rowdiest seats were in the very back. The cheapest food at those theaters was peanuts. And so when spectators were unhappy with the performers, they would throw peanuts. Um, so during segregation, the back gallery, the cheap seats, was pretty much the only place where Black people could sit, and it became associated with Black people being unruly, and not having opinions that mattered, which is why this is problematic. Why is it complicated? Well, most people's introduction to this, because peanut gallery usage comes from all the way back in the late 1800s, but why do we still use it today? Because of the Howdy Doody show. So the Howdy Doody show popularized the phrase in the 50s and 60s because they had a crowd of children called the Peanut Gallery, which were the children watching the show, and they would elicit their responses. And so most people using this now are thinking of the Howdy Doody show, are thinking of children, and so they don't necessarily think of it as being something racist. And but it does come initially from a racist idea that Black people's opinions didn't matter, that these were just people shouting and being rowdy. Follow up. There we go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Shannon told me about this one. Um, Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I was raised that it's eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. That has not always been the case. It had another way of being sung prior to the 1950s, which used a slur. Um, and so I didn't know this, but apparently there was an actual like campaign to reteach children a different version of this song after the 50s when they're like, oh, we can't really say that anymore. So has it been sanitized? Is it something that we can continue to use because we did make a conscious effort to change it? Open question. The itis, what it is used to mean. It is used as the lethargic or sleepy feeling you get after eating a large meal. This is a term that is used mostly in the Black community, and so there is somewhat of an idea of reclaiming this because originally it comes from N-word-itis, meaning it was characterizing Black people as being lazy. Um, in a more modern sense, you need to watch out for reworkings of this, like senioritis, which is when I was a senior in high school, everyone had senioritis, which is you're feeling very lazy, you're feeling very unmotivated for school, you're not going to do things because you're a senior, you're almost out of here, go on your way. And boy, did I not know where that came from until very recently. So watch out for reuses, modern uses that step on previously offensive things. Mumbo jumbo used to mean
Could I
a, oh,
just
go ahead,
one
Jane.
other thing? This is one of those places where context matters because itis is an actual medical suffix that can actually have a legitimate meaning. But like what you're talking about with senioritis, it is very clearly a play off of this other version that was specific to laziness and specific to to people that they were derogatorily referring to. So I just want to be clear, like the context does matter. Because if you get mad about things or you get aggrieved on behalf of somebody because they're diagnosed with an actual condition with itis in it, this is one of those times where you could overstep um, and create more conflict than necessary because you're taking the actual uh, insult and applying it in places where none was
Mhm.
essentially because it's not racist to have appendicitis. And we don't want to accidentally step on toes of people who do have similar viewpoints that we do, that we should avoid racism or that we should avoid insulting language and stuff like that. And it's important to make sure that the dialogue is open to figure out why these things are the way they are.
Yep, a good point. Okay, mumbo jumbo, used to mean confusing or meaningless language or a nonsense ritual. Um, comes from white colonialists. It comes from an African word, mama jambu, which refers to a masked male religious figure. So there were colonists in Eastern Africa, and they encountered this religious figure, and they would write back to their friends in England, friends and family in England, with the words mumbo jumbo, talking about the incomprehensibility of these religious practice. Um, and so it became then a way of saying, well, no one can understand this. This is just mumbo jumbo. Oop. All right. But not everything is racist against Black people. No, we are equal opportunity haters. And so we are going to do racist things against other people. So we have long time no see and a similarly phrased no can do. Um, it's used to mean it's been a while in one case, and I'm not going to do that in the other. So where does that come from? It comes from, it was historically used to mock people who used broken English or odd constructions of English because they were not native speakers. In some cases, the the history disagrees on whether this was making fun of Chinese immigrants or Indigenous Americans. And it could be both, it could be either. Um, but it was meant to mock non-native speakers. And related in terms of mocking non-native speakers is chop chop. It means to hurry up. Hey, get this done. And it's typically something that's going to be said from a superior to a subordinate. It comes from the shipping world, where in the shipyards, English speakers would hear the Cantonese word cop, the Chinese sailors calling to each other, saying cop to each other, which means do it quickly or make haste. It was then used to speak down to those workers, being like, hey, get it done, chop, chop. And I put this one separately from the others because this is also where we get the word chopsticks from. So there is no good answer on what do you use instead of chopsticks, but it is worth noting that the word that we use, this ubiquitous word for all Asian versions of chopsticks, is from, oh, you know those guys that say chop all the time? They're sticks. That's where we get chopsticks from. Um, So to answer it, so the question is, well, then what do they call it? Well, it depends on who you're talking to. You're going to have the Japanese word, the Korean word, the Chinese word. Different cultures call them different things. So there's not really a good answer to what do I use instead, but it is an interesting tidbit as to where we get the word from in the first place. Checking my chat real quick. The paddy wagon. What is a paddy wagon? It's the enclosed motor truck used by police to carry prisoners. It typically would go around at night and round up people who were not doing good things or who were too drunk or whatever to put them in to get them to the jail overall. Why do we call it a paddy wagon? Well, paddy is a shortened form of Patrick, which is used as a slur against Irish people. And so the paddy wagon was the idea that, well, going around and collecting drunks, well, they're all going to be Irish. So we'll just call it the paddy wagon because the Irish are the ones, they're the drunken, unruly people. Um, they're going to make up the majority of the people in the vehicle. There are a lot of there are a lot of ones against Irish people, as you're gonna see. We're gonna just do a couple. All right, beyond the pale, what it is, what it's mean to be. So behavior that is beyond the bounds of acceptability. Where does it come from? When the English were occupying Ireland, there was the safe place around Dublin, which was called the Pale. Anything outside the Pale was considered to be lawless and uncivilized because it was outside English control. And so to say that something is beyond the Pale means that it is outside acceptability. However, this is disputed. Pale means boundary fence or enclosed area, and so it's possible that this phrase is older than the specific English pale in Ireland. So it may be offensive, it may not be. We're not entirely sure if it came from this or if it had an earlier date. Hooligan. It means a violent young troublemaker, typically someone who's part of a gang. It comes from the name Houlihan. Um, associated with rowdy London youths. There was an actual hooligan gang at one point. Um, oh, sorry, heard my baby. There was an actual hooligan game, yeah, gang at one point, but the term came to be used as a more broad reference for Irish youths in general, and then became just violent young people. Low man on the totem pole. It's used to mean someone who's the least important position or the lowest rank. It comes from the native tribes of the Pacific Northwest. They create totem poles, which are these wooden structures with figures and symbols engraved upon them. However, and very importantly, the low man on the totem pole was extremely important. That is not the lowest hierarchy ranking. So this comes from a complete misunderstanding of the culture itself. So it's offensive on, oh, sorry, excuse me. It's offensive on a couple fronts, which is it's appropriating the culture, trivializing the culture, and then misrepresenting the culture. And so there's just better ways. And I think a takeaway of this is to use accurate and appropriate language. And so especially if you are misrepresenting the actual artifact, there are better and more appropriate ways to get the same point across. So you can say, "Oh, he's at the bottom of the pile." Those kinds of things can give you the same idea without using an offensive reference. That's my spirit animal. It is used as a like a person, a character, or sometimes inanimate objects that a person strongly identifies with or feels a connection to. This became really popular in the 2000s to say that something was your spirit animal. Um, it comes from some beliefs. Some indigenous groups have beliefs related to a spiritual guide who represents a connection or offers guidance, protection, wisdom, power, etc. But generalizing as this idea of like, oh, well, all Native American people have spirit animals. or anyone can have a spirit animal misrepresents the culture again. Um, it's a misuse. It for some of the groups that have a concept of a spirit guide, it is not something that you choose, and it is certainly not open to everyone. It is something that chooses you, or that you have to go through a process or a um, some sort of spiritual journey in order to have a spirit guide. Off the reservation. It means to act independently or deviate from expected behavior. Politics uses it to mean going rogue. Um, and it makes light of the suffering of Native peoples. So Native Americans were forced into reservations that were created by the US government, and they weren't really allowed to leave. So there would be reports of the law people who were in the area being like, oh, all of our Indians are on the reservation. Um, no one's gone off the reservation. And they were being entirely serious about it. And then over time, it changes to mean acting inappropriately. And so it makes light of the suffering as well as implying that Native people didn't deserve the right to move around freely. And then gypped. If you are not aware, the word gypsy is a slur. Um, and it what you're who you're referring to is the Roma people or the Romani people who are also called travelers, a nomadic group of people, typically in Europe. Um, that have been persecuted for a very, very long time and continue to be persecuted to this day. Um, Gypt is a shortened word of that and implies that all of the Roma people are thieves, untrustworthy, they're out to swindle you. And so you can just say cheated. Cheated works great. You don't have to say this.
I want to make one clarification since I apparently have my pulse on like the federal government.
Go for it.
There are official versions of Gypsy that are not considered to be offensive because people have taken them as their actual culture. And so Gypsy with a capital G, as you have it here, is often meant to encompass a group of people who no longer, if I understand this correctly, like identify specifically as Roma, but are like traditionally from cultures that were nomadic and or have splintered off from this like major branch. And so it's used as an official terminology or designation for a culture or group of people. However, if you're using it in a negative way, very obviously that doesn't that doesn't meet this definition. But you may see this in an official capacity, like on census things or on records, especially historical ones for like what ethnicity people are, and sometimes even where they came from. Because the longer somebody has been away from essentially like Eastern Europe and Europe, the more likely they are to use this category as the definition of what they consider themselves. So that's again,
All
clarity
right.
of intention is important, whereas gypped very clearly has a negative connotation no matter how you use it.
That is super interesting. And there's a little bit of like the culture reclaiming itself involved in that. That's very good to know. Thank you, Shannon. Uh-oh. Hello, everyone. Are we still together? We still here? All right. Just had someone try to take over. Whoops, that's sexist. Hysterical. How it's used. It means that you've been affected by uncontrolled or extreme emotion. It comes from the Greek word for uterus. And then in the 19th century, hysteria was an actual diagnosable illness, typically for women. And so the term hysteria was used as a way of saying, well, she's a woman. You know how women are. That's the issue. And so you have women being belittled or set aside because of presumed predisposition to mental and emotional disorders. Um, It is still hysterical is still a word that's used that's weaponized against women. Talking about women being too emotional to be leaders, women being too at the whims of their hormones to make good decisions. She's hysterical. It undercuts the idea that um, a woman might have a reasonable grievance by simply dismissing it as hormones or emotions. Yes, I do. Okay. Then there's the word spinster. It's used to be an unmarried woman, typically an older unmarried woman, and it originally comes from an occupation to spin wool or spin thread, because it was one of the few occupations that women could have that would allow them any sort of independence. So someone who was making it independently on her own without the need of a man was typically a spinster. It was then used derogatory, of course, to refer to women who chose not to marry or who had too, what men considered too high of standards. Um, Much like today with the male loneliness epidemic, men were concerned because women weren't dating them or marrying them specifically. And so they used this fear mongering, this idea of like, well, if you don't lower your standards, you're going to find yourself alone and 30 and just a spinster because you don't have a man to provide for you. And that's where spinster comes from. Women, of course, are worth more than just the men that we are connected to. And being unmarried is not itself a problem, and it is not just because you are older and unmarried does not mean that you are worthless to society. The rule of thumb. It means a quick or approximate method based on common sense or experience rather than calculation. It supposedly comes from 18th century English law that allowed men to beat their wives so long as the stick was no wider than their thumb. Why do I have a footnote? Because we actually don't know if that's where it comes from. It's disputed. There was no official rule of thumb on law. There have been some speculations. There was this particular judge who maybe or maybe did not make the ruling, but there is no official law. However, we do know that men were legally allowed to beat their wives in moderation, whatever that means. So, rule of thumb in some to some people might be considered offensive, believing depending on whether or not they believe this. It could also just come from using your thumb as a form of measurement, craftsmen, so on. And then tomboy. It means a girl who typically enjoys boyish things, dresses boyishly. In the mid 16th century, tomboy literally referred to boys. It was the name Tom, which is extremely common, and boy put together, and it meant just a boisterous boy, a rowdy guy. The meaning shifted about 20 years later to meaning a bold and immodest woman and started to be associated with sexual promiscuity. And then another 20 or so years later, it transitioned to its final meaning, and this is 1600, so this is a while ago. Its final meaning, which is what it is today, which means a girl who dresses in practical clothing or enjoys adventurous or rowdy activities. Why is it offensive? It is a sexist stereotype that says that women should follow prescribed gender norms. It has been used to police girls and shaming girls into acting more feminine, even though wearing practical clothing, enjoying sports and adventure does not necessarily mean that you're not a girl. Those are all things that should be and are open to girls as part of a normal spectrum of femininity. Um, but fun fact, tomboy is not just sexist, it's racist. Why is it racist, Daphne? What could possibly be racist about this? So, in the end of the 18th century, going into the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, people were concerned about the birth rate, specifically the white birth rate. Again, parallels to what we're dealing with now. They were concerned about white women not having enough babies, and they looked around for problems and solutions, and they noticed that women had been wearing lots of very tight corsets and heavy dresses, and maybe that wasn't so great for their uterus, their baby maker. Um, and so it became acceptable for girls to start wearing looser fitting clothing, more boyish clothing, perhaps, because that would be good for their overall health and therefore good for their reproductive health. And then white women would start having more babies. And so there became a American acceptance, at least in white circles, of being a tomboy so long as you were a white woman. Um, Interesting fact. I'm gonna talk about a little bit more about tomboy. So tomboy is tomboy offensive. Um, again, it's gonna depend on who you ask. There are women who fall into this categorization of being enjoying more masked clothing, who don't find it offensive at all. They claim it for themselves, saying, "Yeah, this is just the category of girl that I am. I'm not a boy, but I am a masculine woman, and that's okay." And so it's not necessarily offensive from that perspective. Ableism. Let's talk about ableism. There's a caveat at the beginning of this one because ableist language is some of the most insidious language in this list. It is so pervasive, it is so ingrained. We deal with it all the time to the point that we don't necessarily think about it as offensive, and where it's very difficult to imagine not using some of these words because they are so part of our lives. They feel so benign. However, as with everything else in this presentation, I'm just presenting the history of it. I'm telling you where it comes from, why it might be considered harmful. What you do with that information is up to you. But these words are so far removed from context for a lot of us that we don't think of them as being ableist anymore. Starting off strong with dumb. That's so dumb. He's so dumb. What it means lacking in intelligence. However, what it literally means is lacking the ability to communicate verbally. So this may be someone who is deaf and not speaking, or it may be someone who's autistic and not speaking, nonverbal. But for whatever reason, if a person is unable to communicate verbally, the word is dumb. And that does not mean that they are stupid. It simply means they don't speak. Lame. We use it to mean boring or dull. This one really came to prominence in the 90s and it has not left. But it actually means body parts, especially limbs, that don't function properly. Person who cannot walk well because of an injury or disability is not boring or dull. They are lame. Spastic, or in the 90s and 2000s, people would say spaz. Don't be a spaz. Spastic, and Shannon would know this, is a actual medical term. It has to do with involuntary or erratic muscle movements. Um, but when we dissociated it from that and started saying, don't be spastic, don't be a spaz, we meant it as someone behaving in a chaotic or erratic way. But those are actual muscle control issues. Sometimes, like cerebral palsy, for example, would be an example of when you might have that. Stupid, moron, and idiot. All of these mean lacking intelligence. And that is what they have meant historically as well, but they were actual medical designation for intellectual disabilities. Cretin. I included this and I separated it from the other ones simply for historical information. Um, it typically is used to mean someone who lacks intelligence, but in a vulgar or insensitive way, kind of like villainizing. The word cretin, however, comes from the word Christian and was used to refer to people who had a mental disability as a way of reminding the population around them that these two were Christian, these two are humans, and you need to treat them with respect and dignity. It backfired, obviously, because then the word came to mean lacking intelligence. in everyday speech, but was originally meant to be a way of saying, hey, pity this person. They're also human, just like you. All of the versions where you use blind, a blind spot, a blind date, blind sighted, it means you're not aware of something. But being ignorant is not the same as having a physical blindness. Now, is this a metaphor like push too far? Who knows? But is it something that could be offensive to people who are actually blind? If you say to someone, if you're road raging, for example, and someone cuts in front of you and you yell, "Are you blind?" That's, you know, they're not. You know, they're just not paying attention. Similarly, we have, "Are you deaf?" or for something to fall on deaf ears. Um, I mean, not being aware of something or perhaps ignoring something, but again, ignorance is not the same as a physical disability. And we'll end our presentation with the homophobic section, which is while looking for these, there's only one in this section. Um, because a lot of our homophobic language is very overtly offensive. Um, yeah, it's not separated enough anymore for us to know. But as a American, this caught me by surprise. So bugger is used as a mild expletive or to express anger or frustration. For example, in Harry freaking Potter, we have bludger, nasty little buggers. A bugger is someone who engages in anal sex. So this is anti-gay. Um, at buggery being sodomy. Um, but it's used in a freaking children's book. Like it's something that I was so exposed to, I thought it was completely benign. Um, it's just, yeah, shocked to find that out. Did I include another one? Nope, nope, just me. I'm offensive. All right. I I hope you all enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have some food for thought as you continue going on. We do have time for questions. If anyone has them, you can raise your hand or put them in the chat. But if you would like to get into contact with me, I am Daphne Strassert. You can find me at daphnestrassert.com or on tomeworksedits.com. You can email me at daphne@tomeworksedits.com, or you can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet as Daphne the Writer. Um, yeah, thank you. This is Writer's Lunch. We meet every Thursday at 1 p.m. Central Time. You can find us on YouTube if you would like to watch some of our old videos. And you can join our Discord server, although I don't have a link to that right this second. Um, but yeah, thank you everyone so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot.
So while people may be asking questions in the chat, I did want to ask if you had any resources for people who maybe are concerned about use of language, because I mean this is an incomplete list. These are
Very
ones
much
that we
so.
either found surprising or so ubiquitous that people don't realize the depth of the history and the connotation. So are there, as writers, resources that you can provide us that we can access if we're trying to make sure that we're using either inclusive language or at least non-insulting language? Um, and again, as you said,
Fine.
like, sometimes you want your bad guys to say bad things to make them obviously bad guys, but if we're trying to make sure our good guys don't trespass on this.
Yeah, let me pull up my link because I do have a good link. There's a lot of Googling involved. Um, is that? No, that's not it. I'm sorry. I am struggling to. There it is. The Micropedia of Microaggressions. Um, hold on. I should have prepared this beforehand.
I
Micropedia.
apologize. While you're looking for that one, I'm going to go ahead and talk about an older one. So, Writing with Color is also a really good one. It is not new. This is an old resource. I think it's been around for 10, maybe 15 years. And if you've noticed that people don't use the fruits or chocolate or food essentially to describe the skin of people who are not white. Um, it's because that's offensive. It's moved out of our nomenclature so that we aren't essentially itemizing our characters and the people they represent in our stories. So writing with color is a really good one to help you figure out how to convey skin tone as well as other things without defaulting to turning that person into an object or comparing them into a good. um, so if you are working to describe your characters and they don't look like you, or you're not part of a culture that would do that consistently, this is a good resource to help you in there. And then Daphne, you want to talk about the Micropedia?
Yeah, so the Micropedia is, let me reopen some closed tabs. Um, the Micropedia has a lot, it's separated by category, and it's not as extensive in some cases, and it focuses much more on microaggressions, which can be like questions that you are asking people that are actually offensive, or assumptions that you're going to make about people that can be offensive. But it is separated by gender, class, race, sexual orientation, etc. So it's worth a browse in terms of finding out things that maybe you are doing yourself that are not so that are not going to be kind to minority people around you.
I did want to share one other resource. You don't have to buy the book, but there's an actual style guide for inclusive language called This Conscious Style Guide. Joining the newsletter allows you to get tidbits from the original author and then actually a group of people who work with her to help essentially like unbrick the things you've bricked with bad language. Because the goal is to not shut people up, but help them communicate in a way that allows them to reach broader audiences without being insulting or accidentally aggressive. And so the Conscious Style Guide is a great resource both for editors and for writers to help clarify your actual like communication and message so that it can be received on an even playing field, which I hope that idiom isn't a
Yeah,
problem.
I think that one's fine.
Okay.
Learn your idiom. I mean, if you want to just understand the world better, learn where your idioms come from. It is also a lot of fun. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And join us next week when we're talking about regionalism in American fiction.